whether it's expanding claims, um, adding attorney's fees to eligible costs that can be recovered in a case. We're concerned about a trend toward really increasing business liability. And, that sounds very boring, but all of you know, especially if you're a small business and maybe you don't have an attorney on staff, that if you get dragged into court, even if the case goes in your favor, you can spend a lot of time and money um, processing that case before um, a judge might rule in your favor. And so we want to make sure that that doesn't start to affect Colorado's business climate. Another theme that we've noticed, and this has been the case for a number of years, is a lot of legislators looking to pass bills that will improve our quality of water, our air quality, our reduction of greenhouse gases. I'll talk more about that in a little bit. We saw a lot of legislation aimed at protecting disadvantaged groups, whether that is making sure that justice is available for women who have been harassed in the workplace, or minority populations that have had interstates built through their communities and the effects that that has had on them. A lot of legislation aimed at righting wrongs and making sure that all sorts of different people have full access to their rights and the privileges of living in our society. And then another theme is we've really seen a lot of storytelling happening. This is one, again, that we've noticed for a few years. And I think it's important that the business community take note, particularly of this one. So a lot of times what we see in committee hearings down at the Capitol is proponents of legislation will bring in people who've been affected by the issue, and they will tell their personal stories, and it's really compelling. And then the business community shows up and we say, well, we have numbers and we have data and this costs money, and we don't think that this is a good idea. And it's not particularly effective. There's just a real mismatch there of personal stories of people affected by an issue versus numbers that just are not as compelling. And we see that go both ways. I'll talk in a little bit about an instance where the business community did a good job of telling stories and was more effective at that. So moving on, I'm going to run through some topics and some specific bills. I'm going to do this pretty quickly in the interest of time so that we can get to questions and talking to your representatives. But feel free to chime in if you have questions or you want me to go into a little more detail. But certainly one of the main themes of this session is housing. And I don't have to tell any of you that we are seeing an affordable housing crisis in our state. And this is one of the issues that C3 sees as a top challenge to our competitiveness as a great place to do business and a great place for people to build lives. And certainly the governor and our legislators agree, and we saw a lot of legislation aimed at trying to rectify that situation. The signature bill, of course, was Senate Bill 213, which was dubbed land use. And I know a lot of you were very involved in that bill, and ultimately it did not make it out of the session. But I think that it has pushed the conversation forward. We're going to see a lot of conversations this summer and certainly next session around a lot of the particular aims of that bill. Maybe we'll see them as different bills this time, but certainly a lot of discussion on that one. And where is the most appropriate place for housing policy to be determined? Is it at the state level, because this is a matter of statewide concern, or is it at the local level where specific conditions and differences between communities can be effectively dealt with? House Bill 1255 was a prohibition on local communities making arbitrary growth caps and limits on building permits. This was a bill that C3 supported because while it sounds like a great idea, and certainly as concerns about growth proliferate in our communities, a lot of communities are saying, maybe we just put a timeout on this, or we limit the amount of growth that we have because we have limited resources to accommodate it. But unfortunately, we have seen those policies play out in terms of simply increasing costs within a community that has growth restrictions and pushing out a lot of the burdens of the affordable housing and infrastructure onto neighboring communities. We were very pleased to see that bill pass. There were a lot of bills that had to do with not just housing for sale, but housing for rent. And we saw a lot of these concerns really crop up during the pandemic, and policies that were put in place to make sure that people were not evicted because they had unusual challenges because of the pandemic in paying the rent. And some of that is carried over as then legislators have looked at the larger picture of people who rent their homes. So we saw some bills that looked at evictions or non-renewal of leases, criteria for leasing, rental housing, and so on. And then the last topic in this category is metro districts. And many of you may remember that a couple of years ago, the Denver Post did a series of articles really diving into the use of metro districts and was fairly critical of some of the provisions and how those play out and how they affect people who may live in a metro district and not realize the financial burden or the implications. And so in the last couple of years, we've seen a number of bills aimed at increasing transparency or changing the way that debt can be issued and repaid related to those financing tools. I'm going to pause for a second here. Chris, do we have any questions on housing before I move on to the next topic?
Nope, I do not see any questions in the chat or the Q&A, so I think you're good, Rachel. Thank you.
All right, then I'm going to move on to kind of our bread and butter as chambers and business organizations, labor and employment bills. And I think it's interesting to note, you know, in past years when we've assessed previous legislative sessions, this has been a lot longer list than you see this year. It's kind of surprising, but some pretty big bills on this front. The first there that you see, Senate Bill 172, the Power Act, is one that I think is a real success story. As many of you know, this has been on the table for a number of years, and the business community has opposed it and killed previous versions. It deals with changing the definition of harassment and discrimination in the workplace and what cases could be eligible to go to court. And businesses have been very concerned about that because the current definition that we have is based on 40 years of case law. And so the concern was in changing that definition, would businesses be more susceptible to cases without merit that would have to be litigated in court while the courts figured out, you know, flushed out the new definition. And so over months and months of meetings, C3, the state chamber, the Special District Association, and some attorneys that we are fortunate to have at C3 who work on a pro bono basis for us, met with the proponents and the sponsors, and we worked through a number of specific concerns, really rolled our sleeves up and got into the weeds on that bill, and were able to reach a compromise that the proponents and the sponsors felt protected victims of harassment and discrimination and gave them more access to justice and to compensation that they deserve in the workplace. And we were able to get a lot of protections for businesses who are working to make sure that their workplaces are respectful environments. And I think it's just a great example of something that we firmly believe, which is if people really want to solve an issue and they're willing to sit down together and talk through the issues, it is possible to figure out a path to success. So it took a lot of work, but we did it. Fair Work Week was another bill that got a lot of press and attention. This is one that I referred to earlier in mentioning storytelling. This bill would have required mostly employers in the service industry, retail and restaurants, but also had implications for other businesses as well, in terms of posting schedules in advance. And then it had a number of requirements for minimum hours and a fine and fee structure for changes that would be made outside of a certain window in advance. And the idea here was to make sure that workers in those industries have a measure of predictability in their work schedules so that they can plan for things outside of work, doctor's appointments and things of that nature. So I think it was very well intentioned, but the practical application is going to be very challenging for industries that really rely on flexibility in order to respond to their customer demands. And what came out in the committee testimony was all sorts of employers and employees of those kinds of businesses showed up and said, we actually don't think that this legislation would be helpful. And, I've worked in this industry, or I've employed people in this industry for decades. And the flexibility on both sides is really what makes it work. And workers talked about how they actually appreciate being able to make changes to their schedules at the last minute so that they can go to their kids' sports games, or they can travel on short notice, or whatever it is that they want to do outside of work. And so, again, having people show up and tell those individual stories versus, somebody like me coming and saying, well, this percentage of people said in a survey that they're okay with this kind of scheduling, was much more effective. And the legislators in the committee that first heard that bill spoke to how they listened to those stories and all of the emails that they got as well from people who talked about how this bill would affect them. So that bill died in committee. I think we'll see some form of legislation in the future, again, aimed at that intent of giving people a little more predictability. But this particular version didn't make it out. And then there was a bill that was aimed at gig workers and Uber drivers, Lyft drivers, that sort of employment in particular, that may seem pretty niche to all of you, but again, there were some implications for larger businesses and how we treat independent contractors that had us weighing in. That bill too did not make it out of committee. Questions or comments on this one before I move on?
If anyone does have questions, please use the Q&A feature, or I'll also check the chat feature. But Rachel, right now we do not have any, so you maintain the floor.
I'll keep going then. Next category I want to talk about is environmental legislation. And as I mentioned, we saw a number of pieces of legislation aimed at air quality. There have been many years that we have seen wildfires cloud our skies and significantly affect our air quality. And certainly as the state works toward its climate goals and reducing greenhouse gas emissions, this is a topic that has been very top of mind. C3 counts among our members, as I'm sure you all do as well, a number of utility companies, manufacturers, and other industries who are affected by these measures. And most of them are trying really hard to do business in a way that is cleaner and more efficient. I was very heartened to see a number of power plants come offline early, or announce plans that coal-fired power generation was going to be transitioned even earlier than planned to renewable energy sources instead. That's a transition that we're all figuring out how to navigate. And so some of this legislation was aimed at accelerating that transition. One bill in particular there, Senate Bill 198, was looking at, House Bill 1039, was looking at making sure that all utilities are reporting up to the state, their capacity and how they are making that transition, so that we can ensure as a state that we're doing so in a way that ensures reliable power and affordable power for businesses, for homeowners, for renters, as we make that transition. So a lot of activity in this category. I'm going to keep this one pretty high level again in terms of time, but if there are any you want me to talk about more specifically, I can do that. Nope,
I think please continue, Rachel.
All right. Obviously, as chambers, we're all very interested in economic development, and there were a lot of great bills this session, particularly in the vein of making sure that we are investing state dollars in training people for in-demand careers. This is awesome for both our businesses who are having trouble finding workers in a lot of these key positions, as well as for young people or transitioning workers who may not want to go to college, or they may want to transition from one career to another. We're also seeing some investments that will help Colorado take advantage of legislation passed at the federal level that will invest infrastructure dollars or other stimulus dollars into advanced industries. We have a lot of those in the state of Colorado, and it's something that as a country, we are falling behind on when we look at competition globally with countries like China or even Germany is really surpassing us in terms of investments in advanced industries, in patents, in workforce, and things of that nature. So we were really pleased to see a lot of those investments and incentives get passed. We have also recreated, that's not the right word, extended the Rural Opportunity Office, which really will support economic development in areas outside of the Front Range, where, as you all well know, there are a lot of unique challenges and not the same sorts of resources that often exist in more populated areas. And then one bill that we were really pleased to see get some necessary changes, and that is a lot thanks to Senator Roberts, was House Bill 1192. This was a bill that really would have increased liability for businesses and would have interacted with Colorado's unique construction defects laws, which, as you all know, have really limited condo development in Colorado, and extended that to single-family home development. The bill began as some updates to consumer codes that are in line with what a lot of states are doing around the country, but there were some provisions added later in the bill's process that would have had the effects I described, and we were really pleased to be able to work with legislators to get those taken out so that we can do no further harm to our housing situation. That is my very quick overview of some of the key business bills that we saw this session. So if anybody has questions or there are bills that you worked on this session that we didn't talk about, you want to raise those issues, happy to do that now.
Yeah, so Rachel, there is one question, and it is, do any of the housing or environmental bills cover regulations on square footage on house size?
I cannot think of one off the top of my head. I know we have some legislators on here who can correct me if I am not remembering that correctly.
Okay, thank you. And that's the only question that I do see. So we'll turn it over to you with the Q&A for our elected officials. And thanks again for everyone for tuning in.
Okay. Well, I see that we have Speaker of the House, Julie McCluskey, on the call, and Senator Dylan Roberts, Representatives Megan Lukens and Elizabeth Velasca. Welcome.
Thanks for having us.
So we thought we would start with each of you just doing a brief introduction of the areas that you represent and the committees that you served on, and then we have some questions that we'll ask you about the session. So maybe we'll start with you, Speaker McCluskey.
Thank you, Rachel, and I really appreciated your overview. I want to give a shout out to Chris Romer and all of the different chambers here today. What a great opportunity for all of us to connect and engage and talk about a very successful session and a very busy session. My name is Julie McCluskey. I currently represent House District 13, which includes the beautiful 6 counties of Jackson, Grand, Summit, Lake, Chaffee, and Park. And this is my 3rd term in office.
Thank you. And Speaker McCluskey, I just want to say I thought you did a fabulous job in a very difficult job. The Speaker of the House is probably the definition of thankless job. And I just really appreciated the way that you encouraged everyone to work together and tried to facilitate conversations among diverse points of view. It was noted and appreciated. Senator Roberts, will you go next?
Absolutely. Good afternoon, everybody. Thank you, Rachel, and thanks to Chris Romer as well for hosting this, and thanks everybody for tuning in. It's great to be here. I'm Dylan Roberts. I have the honor of serving as state senator for Senate District 8, which is 10 counties that include Eagle, Summit, Grand, Jackson, Routt, Moffett, Rio Blanco, parts of Garfield, Gilpin, and Clear Creek counties, and previously had served 2 terms in the House. So this was my first year in the state Senate. And I serve as the chairman of the Agriculture and Natural Resources Committee, and then as a member of the Judiciary Committee and the Local Government and Housing Committee. And looking forward to the discussion today.
That's a lot of big ones. Thank you. Representative Lukens, want to go next?
Yes, hello. Thank you so much for having me. My name is Megan Lukens, and I'm honored to represent House District 26, which includes Eagle, Routt, Moffett, and Rio Blanco counties. I serve on the Education Committee and the Agriculture, Natural Resources, and Water Committee, and am excited to be here today. Looking forward to everyone's questions.
Thank you. And last but not least, Representative Velasco.
Hi, everyone. I'm Representative Velasco. I represent House District 57 in the Western Slope. It includes Pitkin, Garfield County, and also the Roaring Fork area of Eagle. And I sit on the Agriculture and Natural Resources Committee, also the Energy and Environment Committee, Appropriations, and I'm also the chair for the Wildfire Matters Committee this interim.
That's also a lot of critical committees. So our first question for all of you is, what bill that you sponsored do you think was your biggest success? And whoever wants to brag first can go first. This is the fun one.
I'll jump in. I really appreciated the overview of the bills you highlighted, Rachel. I think the sweetest, most impactful bill that I carried was House Bill 1246, which was about providing free college, no cost credentials to individuals who pursue a credential or associate's degree at one of our community colleges, Colorado Mountain College or Ames College, as well as our area technical colleges. We have a school in Delta County and then 2 down on the Front Range. But if people pursue a credential or degree in early childhood, elementary education, firefighting, law enforcement, any of the construction trades, and that includes apprenticeships in the construction trades as well, or nursing, there is the opportunity to get that credential at 0 cost. We put $38 million into the system to help support individuals pursuing these different credentials after seeing workforce shortages following the pandemic in a number of these critical areas. This bill was based on a pilot program that we launched last year, where we were paying for healthcare workforce credentials and saw a significant increase in the number of both traditional age students and adults pursuing a new career pathway. And because of that success, we wanted to broaden that and increase the training and education to members of Colorado's communities all across the state. So really excited to see that program follow on the heels of a successful pilot, and hope that there's ways for our business community to incentivize and encourage folks to pursue these degrees, hopefully alleviating some of the workforce crunch that we've seen since the pandemic concluded.
Thank you. That was a great bill. We really appreciated you bringing that forward. It's all of those professions that you mentioned are seeing shortages and are really critical to our communities.
I'm happy to go next if we're just keeping the same order. So my highlight bill that I would mention for this session is Senate Bill number 1. And this is a bill that Representative Lukens was one of the House sponsors of when it came over to the House. But this is a really exciting bill because we worked with people like Chris Romer and others on this. This is a bill that is going to allow public-private partnerships for affordable housing development to happen on underutilized or unused state-owned land. And so what this bill will do is empower the public-private partnership office that exists at the state level to engage with local public-private partnerships between county governments, municipal governments, chambers of commerce, local companies, and obviously a private developer and nonprofits to build housing on these parcels of land that the state has identified that are either owned by the state land board or CDOT, for example, and basically lease them over to this public-private partnership or sell them at a very low cost and dramatically reduce the land costs and allow those housing developments to happen at a much more expedited and cost-efficient way. The proof of concept for this is where the bill actually got signed into law by the governor last weekend here in Eagle County along in Dow Junction between Vail and Avon, where there is some CDOT land that's being underutilized, and the state land board is going to lease it over to the municipalities and the county and a private developer to build the first phase, at least 80 units of workforce housing, and then the second phase could be over 200 more. And they've identified pieces of land in Routt County, I know in the Roaring Fork Valley along Highway 82, Denver, Jefferson County, Trinidad even. This will really happen all across the state, and let's utilize some of this land that hasn't been used before for what we know is a crucial need, which is housing for our workforce. So I'm really excited about Senate Bill 1 and that getting started across the state. And then quickly, I'll just add Senate Bill 6. You mentioned it, Rachel, but just want to highlight the Rural Opportunity Office. That was another bill that I started in the Senate and glad that got done. I think it'll help a lot of small businesses and economic development in our region.
Thank you.
If we're going in order, I believe I was next. I think the bill that I was most proud to sponsor this legislative session was House Bill 1064, which is the Interstate Teacher Mobility Compact. This was actually this is my first legislative session, and this was my first bill that was signed into law. 5 months ago, I was a social studies teacher at Steamboat Springs High School, so I really wanted to prioritize education at the legislative session this year, and was able to do so with this bill. So there are many barriers, as we know, for teachers that are trying to move into the state of Colorado. I know it is all too common at our schools, especially our rural schools, where folks will accept a job offer to be a teacher and then end up having to rescind their acceptance because there are just too many barriers to moving into our state. And so this Interstate Teacher Mobility Compact removes one of the major barriers to teachers moving into the state of Colorado, which is the barrier of licensure. So there are a lot of high quality teachers that want to move into our state, but to get the Colorado licensure, they have to go through a timely process to get their licensure. It includes retaking tests. It includes paying money to take those tests. And when there's already so many other barriers, we wanted to streamline that process. And so this compact creates reciprocity and allows for teachers to move into the state a little bit easier. There's certainly other barriers that are in place, such as the affordable housing crisis. But as Senator Roberts just mentioned, we are working on addressing that as well. And just overall, I wasn't the prime sponsor on the School Finance Act, but I was proud to be supportive of that bill in committee and sign on as a sponsor once the bill progressed. But the School Finance Act this year was also historic. And so I wanted to just uplift that we are investing $181 million more in education this year, including $30 million of one-time funds for rural schools, because we know that our rural schools are acutely feeling the issues that our education systems are facing in the state of Colorado, and 30 million more in special education, as our special education departments are also feeling that impact more acutely. And so I think that we had a lot of education related wins that I was happy to see progress through on the education committee. And I think that the School Finance Act was also one of those.
You're really practicing what you preach there, Rep. Lukens, as a teacher, to go get yourself elected.
Thank you.
Representative Velasco.
Thank you. The piece of legislation that I'm most proud of was House Bill 1257, which helps address the issues in water quality in mobile home parks. We have about 800 mobile home parks in the state, with over 300 in my district alone. And in the Western Slope, we have seen how this is a prevalent issue. And this is where, this is unsubsidized, affordable housing for many of our resort communities, where workers live, working families live. I grew up in mobile home parks in the Vail area. I lived in Avon, in Edwards, and Minturn. So we know that this is an issue that our working families have been dealing with for decades now. So this is just the start, of prioritizing the water quality for all in Colorado. We invested over $4 million to start on the testing campaign and address some of the concerns of our community. We heard from people who have red water coming out of their faucet, or water that smells like sewer, or that causes rashes in their kids, come to testify. And I think, what you were saying around storytelling, I think that this is how the issues are affecting our community on the ground. I think that we talk about policies as these high level state issues, but these are things that affect people, that our working families are feeling. And I was also very proud to bring legislation around language access for insurance, and also for emergency communications. And I really appreciated, working with our business community as a small business owner myself, to have their perspectives and their input. And, I was also the prime co-sponsor of rent control, the 1155, which didn't make it this session, but we had really good conversations, and look forward to bringing that again.
Thank you. I'll confess, I did not follow the first bill that you mentioned, and I'm going to go look that up. That sounds like a good one. So the next thing that we wanted to ask you was to reflect on lessons that were learned this session. And I think it would be interesting to start with our new representatives. So Representative Velasco and Representative Lukens, perhaps you can take this one first.
Sorry, can you repeat the question?
The question was, what lessons did you learn this session?
Yeah, and I could go first. There was a lot of learning, and my skills as a community organizer really, were very useful, because I think there's a lot of negotiation, a lot of stakeholding, a lot of bringing a lot of different perspectives together, and also the importance of relationships, with our colleagues, with people across the aisle, with people in the Senate, and also listening from our local state departments. So I think that there was a lot of learning, but there was also a lot of collaboration that I was very proud to be part of.
That's very encouraging.
As I mentioned, I was a social studies teacher. I was specifically a government teacher before getting elected. And in our government curriculums across the country, we have a tendency to focus on the federal government. And so I learned so much about the state government and just how effective our state government can be. I found the state government to be a place where real bipartisanship was a regular part of the process. And I learned the value of bipartisanship, because I think bipartisan policy is good policy. It's so valuable to have so many different perspectives looking at these policies that we are bringing forward to understand, how does this impact the large amount of people that this bill will impact, and the varying members of each community that certainly need their voice to be heard on each of these bills. So I think that I just learned about how effective the state government can be, especially when it comes to working together, to doing right by Coloradans working hard to get huge successes for the state of Colorado. Overall, I was very impressed by the amount of teamwork that I saw in that chamber, and so I think that was kind of just the lessons learned that I was very, very proud to be a Coloradan throughout that legislative session.
That is nice to hear. Senator Roberts, you want to take this one next?
Sure. I certainly learned a lot. I would say being my first year in the Senate, had done 4 sessions in the House, and similar job, but a different chamber and some different dynamics. I think if I'm going to dig down specifically on one policy, and maybe this gets into a later question or topic, but the big land use bill, Senate Bill 213, about housing. I think the big lesson I learned is the vigor and passion that people have about land use decisions. Certainly something I was aware of, and I'd worked in affordable housing legislation for many years, more on the funding side and the incentive side. So it wasn't as much about dictating, how to build housing, but how to fund it. When we got into talking about how to build housing, you saw some really interesting dynamics play out. Of course, most municipal leaders, mayors, city councilmen, town managers and county commissioners, even though counties weren't necessarily directly impacted by the bill, adamantly opposed, never wanted the state to get involved at all in local land use decisions. And then, of course, housing advocates, but also the business community, and you noted C3's support of Senate Bill 213, were supportive of the land use bill and doing more to cut down red tape and build more housing. And so it was a really interesting dynamic that kind of put people in camps that they're not normally in when it comes to legislative debates. But also showed me that, I've never served on a local level, but a lot of my colleagues have been city councilors or county commissioners, and, learned a lot about why that issue is so hard. And it's because we're a local control state, and our local leaders value their land use authority significantly. So we had a big conversation about it this year. Nothing got that bill didn't get passed, but I imagine that conversation will continue.
I think we're hearing a theme here, and I'll chime in on that one particularly. I thought it was pretty amazing that the sponsors said they had more than 100 stakeholder meetings. And I know there were folks who said, well, I wasn't one of the 100, so, I don't feel included. But I think that is an impressive number. And to clarify, C3 was actually in an amend position, and we submitted a list of 7 specific amendments and some other comments, and really appreciated how open the sponsors were to making changes throughout the process and being open to all of that feedback that, as you said, was there was a lot of it. Madam Speaker.
I have said more than once, Rachel, that my list of lessons learned is longer than some of the exciting successes and celebrations we had this session. I think what I would love to lift up, because it was affirmed for me over and over again, is how well Western Slope legislators work together. We are really fortunate to have just first years in Rep. Lukens and Rep. Velasco who come to the table with such passion and advocacy for their communities, and a real willingness to work in a bipartisan way, to work in a problem-solving way that doesn't always put party politics first. And I think there were a number of bills where we worked collaboratively with members in both the House and the Senate, whether it was water issues, the wolf issues that were very big for us on the Western Slope, or issues related to housing and healthcare, where we have such unique challenges up in the high country. And I'm proud to say that the legislators on today's conversation and many more across the Western Slope really did an exceptional job representing their districts, their communities, and speaking out on the issues that I think are important, not just to us on the Western Slope, but certainly that we have a very unique take and unique perspective on. So it was great to see that kind of legislative work happen in the way that it did, so constructively, and hopeful that we will continue on that same path as we revisit bills like the land use bills and others that didn't make it across the finish line this year.
That's a nice segue to our next question. We wanted to ask you And we've touched a little bit on some of the process of Senate Bill 213 and a lot of differing pieces of feedback on that bill. And one thing I did not mention in my overview was the property tax measures that really were introduced and discussed and passed in the last week or even the last couple of days of the session. And I'm sure you've all heard some concerns about a lack of time for stakeholders to weigh in on those bills specifically. And so how can the process be improved moving forward for some of those big pieces of legislation where you do have a lot of diverse perspectives and people who want to be involved in the process? And whoever wants to tackle that first, jump right in.
I'd love to start, Rachel. I was just speaking with someone this morning about that property tax measure. And while, we often face the challenges of a restricted calendar when it comes to session, 120 days, I think feels too long to many people and too short to many others. It simply isn't enough time to engage in all of the outreach and stakeholding that I think we all want to do and are committed to doing, particularly with people from our districts. The property tax measure really started years ago when we began the work to repeal Gallagher. And I think the challenge has been particularly for government and now property owners is this, what do we do next in the absence of Gallagher since it was repealed? And how do we take care of property owners, residential and commercial? How do we help our businesses when we're seeing property values skyrocket in this particular time in our state's history? And I think the property tax measure, there were a number of conversations happening, but they were happening in the absence of the bill being introduced, right? These are conversations that again started years ago and had been ongoing. We talked a great deal about property tax last session when we passed Senate Bill 238, which provided a 2-year window of relief for property owners. And I think they're, the opportunities now since Senate Bill 303 has been referred to the ballot, will appear in November, is now we have the opportunity to really spend time in our districts with constituents talking about the value of this ballot measure and help people understand how it may serve them in a moment when property values have been skyrocketing. But I think you hit on an issue that is always a challenge for us, and that is in that limited space of time, how do you do all of the outreach and conversation that you want to do, that you need to do, but simply just, not enough hours in the day. Maybe we should legislate that, right? Make it a 28-hour day, something like that. But certainly turn it over to my colleagues for their thoughts about the process.
I don't have too much to add to what the speaker said. I think it's obviously an evolving process, and the property tax conversation is incredibly important. And understand that it felt rushed, and it did happen over a short amount of time. I think there were, I wasn't a prime sponsor. Nobody on this call was a prime sponsor, but I know those conversations were happening before the bill was introduced. Maybe not as much as people had hoped, but it did propose a ballot measure, and so now we get to talk about it as a state. And I just wanted to note that we referred a question to the ballot, and now the voters get to decide what we pass, what doesn't actually become law unless the voters approve of it. So that will be an ongoing conversation over the next few months until we get to November when people cast their votes.
I'll jump in as well, and I think that the speaker and Senator Roberts really summed it up well. But I think that each bill that does make it through the process goes through the process is extensive and purposefully so. And I think that before a bill even gets introduced, the idea is that there is an extensive amount of stakeholding done. And so I think that with a lot of with every bill that really progressed through the process, there were so many brilliant minds behind the bill, and I and just working with all of our colleagues, I know that there were many meetings had when stakeholders would flag some sort of issue or some sort of question. And so at the end of the day, we did I mean, I'm sure the Madam Speaker knows the exact number of bills that progressed through the legislature this session, and we ended up voting on around 500 bills. And at the end of the day, we have to vote yes or we have to vote no on every single bill that progresses forward. And I know that the process is extensive and purposefully so that these bills can become the best that they can be, and that we can hear from people from all sides of every single issue.
Yeah, and I remember hearing that bill in appropriations and hearing from our state firefighters about how this would affect them. And, we worked very hard to get an amendment to make sure that that worked for them. But I also got a lot of emails from people in our community who knew that their assessment rates were going up so high, people who were retired, people who were worried, that they were not going to be able to keep living here or keep aging here because their property tax will go up so high. And I know that we are capped, in many of our communities, which is, that's something that we know. But I think that this was a good solution to bring to the voters so that they can decide if this is something that works for us. But we did include a lot of amendments for affordable housing, for the firefighters. So I was very proud of that work.
I think that was one of the challenges that people were unhappy about. This is an issue that we knew was coming since, as you said, Speaker McCluskey, since we repealed the Gallagher Amendment. And Rep. Velasco, you've hit on some key issues there where I think the reality is there's always going to be somebody who will feel like they were left out of the stakeholder process, because it is a short session and we are dealing with huge issues, a lot of them in that 120-day session. And so the importance of that committee process is if you were one of the people who felt like they didn't get an opportunity before in that pre-bill introduction process, then they get to come talk about it at the committee level. And so to do that in that time crunch at the end of session when you're trying to wrap everything up and the rules have been suspended and things are being pushed through quickly is, we don't necessarily get to make some of those important amendments. And I think that was the concern. As you said, Speaker McCluskey, there were conversations happening beforehand, but until the bill's introduced, there may be things in there that haven't been contemplated or that people need to look at the actual proposal. And we have a lot of faith in all of you that you are going to take that input and make some adjustments before we send that final product on to the voters or to the governor's desk or what have you. And so that's also probably a nice segue into the next question, which is, what's the best way for citizens to engage in that process and to access you as elected officials? And since our audience today is chambers, can you speak specifically to chambers and businesses, how they can best engage as well? For any of you.
I'm happy to start. So I think, and that brings up a great point, and why I'm glad we're having this virtual meeting now that we're done with session, because we are now not only reviewing this past legislative session, but getting ready for next year. It doesn't start until January, but this is actually the exact right time to engage with all of us and tell us about your ideas for the future, any problems you're having that might be able to be addressed by the legislature. Because right now, frankly, we have the time to come meet with you, to dig deeper into issues, to determine whether the legislature is the right forum or whether we can help you a different way. And frankly, and establish those relationships. So I would encourage all of you, if you don't know us yet, or reconnect with us if you have certain ideas or issues you want to talk about. I always love coming to chamber meetings or addressing some of your leadership programs or anything like that. But take the time now. We would love to grab coffee with you, talk to you over the phone, exchange emails about ideas, and right now is really the time where we can put in the long work and really deliberately get bill ideas ready for next year.
I think I may have seen a road show or a road trip schedule that was released.
Yeah, and well, that being said, we also are holding town hall meetings to recap the legislative session, but also meet with constituents in person and hear about their ideas. And I've had or will have town halls with everybody on this call, as my Senate district kind of overlaps everybody's House district. And Julie, the speaker, and I have one tonight in Frisco, and then Rep. Velasco and I have one in Glenwood in a couple weeks, and Rep. Lukens and I and Craig and Meeker coming up. So yeah, certainly welcome your participation in those as well. But we're always available individually as well, and my son might be there too.
What a cutie, he'll drive attendance.
Yeah. I wanted to chime in and thank you, Senator Roberts. I do think, now is our moment to get back in our districts and certainly make connections. But I want to lift up, I saw a couple of our Breckenridge Town Council members on and Breckenridge business owners on here today. During the conversations around the Fair Work Week bill, I had a lot of local businesses call, email, text. I was invited to meetings, which were so helpful in helping me grasp the complexities of both business operations here in the High Country and also how our proposed policy might impact those businesses. And I just can't thank you all enough, and everybody who's on the call today, for that kind of engagement. I can speak for myself, but I think my colleagues would agree, it is difficult when you're dealing with 500 plus bills to talk to every constituent about their perspective on those different policy issues. So when there is something critically important to our business community, I am ever so grateful when people reach out to me and flag for me what their concerns might be, offer to share a visit or a chance to come to a business. I think that's a really powerful way for all of us to learn.
Appreciate that example, because I know that I hear frequently, and you probably, all of you do too, that sometimes individuals or businesses are hesitant to contact you because they feel like, well, who am I? And you are these important elected representatives, and you have so many people vying for your attention, and they don't want to bother you. But it's great to hear that you actually appreciate that people sharing those experiences.
And I'm just going to add to that, for anyone that does feel like you all are bothering us, I'm just going to say you aren't. We like to hear from you. And I want to echo what Senator Roberts said. I'm happy to meet with anyone for coffee, especially in the interim, and then echo what Madam Speaker said, that I very much valued. There are quite a few folks on this call that I was regularly texting or on the phone with throughout session, and I wanted to say thank you for that. And then I'm just going to add on one more thing. A lot of you also presented testimony in many committees that we were in, and I wanted to say thank you for your valuable testimony. Not only is testimony in committee essential, but it's especially essential from our Western Slope and our rural communities and rural resort communities, because sometimes, bills come from the Front Range that disproportionately impact our resort communities and our rural communities, and our voices are very important, and your voice coming out in testimony was very valuable. And so I wanted to say thank you for taking the time to write a speech and testify. I know many of you even drove all the way down to Denver to testify in person, but remote testimony is also very valuable. So please keep that up, because it really helps us out as well.
Yeah, thank you so much. And I also want to share, that at the beginning of the session, just sharing, what my priorities were and my ideas for legislation. I found a lot of very good allies, that I didn't know could be allies. So I think that just having good conversations can really help both sides and can help us all in our communities. But I definitely share, please reach out. We are here for you. We are here representing our community. We want to serve you well, and we want our voices to be heard. Thank you.
Thank you for that. Rep. Lukens, you mentioned committee testimony, and I know one thing that I've struggled with is, especially sometimes when those hearings drag on for hours into the wee hours of the morning, and you all have had to sit there not moving for hours. What can we say in 2 minutes that can be helpful? And so, if anyone can offer any suggestions to all of us, what's most helpful in that context? What can we share with you, or how can we prioritize our 2 minutes of testimony or an email when we know you're getting so many that's really helpful?
I definitely think that the storytelling is very powerful, especially when you have all different types of people in the committee, and a lot of those stories are very compelling, especially when someone comes in and says, I come from your district, I helped elect you, or I helped support you, and this is what I need, and this is how this is affecting me. So I think that just telling your story and how things are affecting you or what your concerns are is very powerful.
Okay, thank you.
I'm going to agree with that as well. When people, we hear so much testimony, but when people start off by saying, I live in Vail, my ears perk up, because that's my district. But also just, I think the power for the folks on this call is circling back to the fact that, we are rural resort or rural communities, and having like a specific anecdote or story or fact that is, that points out how this could impact our communities differently than those along the I-25 corridor is really helpful, especially if you're in some sort of amend position. And just that specificity is very helpful, especially to help those that testimony kind of stand out in our brains as we're listening to so many people testify. But again, it's really helpful, and I found it very valuable.
Thank you. The last thing we wanted to ask you, and then I think we do have some questions in the chat, we have time for that, was what you're most excited about. And session being over is not allowed to be your answer. Other than that, sleeping full evening.
I'd love to throw out that even though session has concluded, we have a great many working groups, task forces, and interim committees that are launching and will get underway here shortly. So there are ways for our mountain chambers to continue to participate in the legislative process. Senator Roberts and I worked on establishing the Colorado River Drought Task Force, which will start here in July. And we know how critical water is to the entire state, but particularly when we talk about the Colorado River on the western slope. That's a priority for all of us. So looking forward to that work happening here starting in July, and some of the other work that we have going on in our public education circles. Certainly the wildfire work that Representative Velasco will be leading this summer is critical. So I'm excited for, a little bit slower pace, but also participating in ongoing policy conversations.
I'll echo that. Obviously, spending time with my son here, who has been joining the Zoom call this afternoon, and spending some time with family and being back home. The speaker's right. We have a lot of really important interim committees that are meeting this over the course of the summer and the fall. It's not an election year, so all of us have more time to focus on policy and getting ready for next session and engaging in that important work. The Drought Task Force, I'm very anxious to follow their work. That's so important to the Western Slope, of course, is protecting the Colorado River. I'll also be the chair of the Water Resource and Agriculture Review Committee that will meet over the summer and the fall, and we can consider bill ideas related to water, agriculture, any sort of small business or economic development that connects to those certainly would be relevant to all of you. We'd love to hear your ideas. The outdoor recreation economy that depends on our water, is there a clear nexus there to both of those committees. It's not just a water issue or an ag issue, like, you know, promoting our Western Slope economies are all interconnected to our natural resources, of course. So would love to hear from you if you have ideas on that. And then looking forward to this important conversation that will continue about housing. I know all of you as members of the business community, whether you own a business yourself or support the business community, you know that if we don't have housing, we don't have an economy, and we have to do better out here in Colorado as a whole, but we face acute challenges here in the mountains and across the Western Slope. So I hope we can have a really productive discussion over the interim on housing and keep the momentum going, frankly, because we've done some great things at the legislature on housing, but we obviously need to do more, and we want to work with all of you to find a solution that can get passed and go into effect.
Amen.
I agree with all of that. Also, just this legislative session was, as I said, my first legislative session. So everything that I experienced was brand new. And so now I know a bit more about what I've signed up for, and just having, you know, knowing what exactly the legislative session looks like, that will be really helpful in preparing for the next legislative session. Also, this last legislative session, just 2 months before the session began, was election day. And so all four of us on this call were in pretty competitive seats. And so I didn't know whether or not I would, you know, win election until actual election day. And so that helped. And so then we only had 2 months to gear up for the legislative session. So I'm just happy to have more than 2 months to prepare for the legislative session. So really in this time, just getting ready for the next session with a lot of great ideas that people are bringing forward, and starting the stakeholding process with a lot of these great ideas to bring a lot of great bills next session. So again, happy to partner with any of you on any potential bill ideas.
And I have been so excited to be back home, you know, with my husband and my dogs. Definitely miss the mountains a lot. And I also look forward to all the work in the interim. You know, clean energy and the clean energy future and a just transition is a huge part of the Western Slope. And, you know, I want to make sure that, you know, we also have environmental justice included in that our workers have access to good training and good paying jobs. So I look forward to doing more of that work, and, you know, working on clean firm energy and hearing what other states are doing to make sure that we put safeguards around our hydrogen opportunities here in the state.
Thank you. I think we have a few questions in the chat and a few minutes to take those. I'm just going to scroll over here, or Chris.
Yeah, we had 2 questions in the chat. The first one, and I'll open it up to any of our elected officials to answer this. In regards to education funding and the negative factor, will there be a consideration of the impact of TIFs and URAs on education funding and other property taxing districts, such as fire, cemetery, affordable housing, libraries, etc.?
I'm happy to start that, and Rep. Lukens, you may want to chime in. Certainly the progress we made in funding public schools was historic this year. We've made the commitment to completely buy down the budget stabilization factor or the negative factor next year. So that'll be another $140 million investment. We increased per pupil funding by $1,000 this year. Certainly anticipate that we will be on track to do with that 140, another significant investment. The property tax measure in particular is designed, we put $200 million of general fund aside to make sure we could backfill any of the impacts that might be felt from that property tax reduction by our local schools. Local governments will also receive backfill dollars if they did not receive more than, if they did not receive 20% or more in revenue increases due to the property value increases across the state. So backfill and making sure that our special districts, certainly our fire districts, as Rep. Velasco mentioned, we tried to make sure we were taking care of those that are impacted by some of these changes. I think long-term, the state has more work to do on the funding front for public schools, and anticipate in the next few years, there may be additional conversations as well as possible ballot measures on how to better fund K-12 schools in this state.
I don't have anything to add. That was a great summary.
Okay, the next question, and this is our last question, I think. Any idea if a guest worker program may still be in the works? It's very hard to find employees. So any idea on a guest worker program in the works?
Not at the state level. Of course, immigration and immigration policy is almost entirely a federal issue. So I would encourage all of you to, collectively or individually reach out to our federal delegation, whether Congressman Neguse, Senator Bennett, Senator Hickenlooper, or Congresswoman Boebert, I imagine is the region here. We desperately need immigration reform. It's an economic issue, absolutely, and hope that that can happen on a federal level.
Yep. Thank you, Senator Roberts. One more question did come in. So I'll give this to you guys too. And this one starts with acknowledging that these are federal issues, but any feedback that you might have would be appreciated. Although these are federal issues, how can you and members of the community be involved to see that the proposed increase in oil trains passing through our mountain region be put to a stop? The second part of that is any information on I-70 improvements or Cottonwood Pass development. So the first question on oil trains passing through, the second on I-70 or Cottonwood Pass.
I'm happy to take the oil trains, and thank you for this question. This is actually an issue we have been a little bit involved with. All of us on this call, Rep. Velasco as well as several of our other Western Slope colleagues, signed a letter and sent it to the federal government, Secretary Vilsack at Department of Agriculture and Secretary Buttigieg at Department of Transportation, strongly urging them to not approve the Uinta Basin Railway project. And then the speaker and I were actually at an event with Congressman Neguse and Senator Bennett in the Glenwood Canyon along the Colorado River a couple months ago, sort of denouncing that project and calling on the feds to not approve that. Not because we're against energy development, but because jeopardizing the Colorado River with such a risky mode of transportation. And we saw after the train crash in Ohio that this is a risky mode of transportation, that tunneling millions of barrels of hot crude oil through Colorado along the Colorado River that jeopardizes that water resource would hurt our environment, our economy, and our way of life. So we've done what we can, I believe, at a state level as state legislators to urge the federal government to closely look at that project. We'll continue to do so. Congressman Neguse and Senator Bennett have been real leaders on this as well. We hope that Senator Hickenlooper and Governor Polis might join them in their opposition. They have not publicly yet, but we hope that they do. And but we'll be following that for sure. As we talked about water earlier, that is a water issue as I see it, and should not be one of the things that's jeopardizing the Colorado River right now. It already has enough threat. Speaker, do you want to talk about I-70 or any transportation funding?
Yeah, I'll speak to a couple of updates, not specifically Cottonwood Pass, but I do want to lift up that ever since the Grizzly Creek fire, I think there's been a greater focus on the resiliency of the I-70 corridor, particularly when we have wildfires and other disasters. I just came from the Transportation Collaborative effort, which meets 2 and 3 times a year to talk about challenges along the I-70 corridor and our connections to Denver. A great deal of funding still to be identified and coming from the Investment and Jobs Act, as well as the IRA. I think that CDOT has been challenged to keep up with the 10-year plan of projects, and certainly with workforce shortages, they face some of the toughest shortages out of any of our state departments. I think some of the projects because of rising inflation and supply chain issues, and then workforce shortages just haven't been moving as quickly as anticipated. I don't have an update on the Cottonwood Pass project, but happy to follow up. We can do that, I guess, with you, Chris, or with others. And I know, at least in the town halls I've been a part of so far, transportation continues to be one of the top issues and concerns for people. And we really appreciate that priority, because it is for all of us and our tourism, outdoor rec-based economies. So more to come for sure.
And if I could just add one more thing about Uinta or any the railway project or anything, transportation funding, Cottonwood Pass, this new Mountain Chamber Alliance, I think, is an incredible idea, and I'm glad you all have joined forces. You all should, if you don't already, a letter to the federal government from local chambers about the economic impact this would have on our region. That is absolutely something you should do, and we're happy to help if you need our help, but often it's just politicians talking to politicians. And if you all can sort of join together and talk about the economic angle of this, that would be really powerful. So that would be one thing I'd encourage for sure.
All
Yes, excellent idea.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you all. Rachel from Colorado Competitive Council, thank you so much for moderating and for providing the session overview from the business perspective. Speaker McCluskey, Representative Lukens, Senator Roberts, and Representative Velasco had to leave at a little bit ago, but we really appreciate all of you guys taking the time out of your day as well, and we appreciate everyone who tuned in. And we did record this, and we'll be sharing this out through our various chamber channels throughout the region. So thank you guys so much. We really appreciate it on behalf of all of our organizations and the relatively new Mountain Chamber Alliance, working together collaboratively. Thank you guys for your time. Thanks for your service to our communities and to the state. And thanks to all the participating chambers for helping get the word out on this today. So thank you guys so much.